Greetings, viewers. Welcome to World War II in a nutshell. World War II was a period of tremendous carnage and world-altering consequence, one that will never be forgotten or ignored. Our journey through this dark period of human history begins now. So don your helmets, buckle in, and let us learn the truth of World War II together. World War II was the largest and deadliest conflict in history. Set during 1939 to 1945, the war saw more countries, soldiers, and civilians take part than ever before and brought devastation on a global scale. The war began on September 1st, 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. This was the first of several major events that changed the course of the war. Next up was the June 1940 fall of France. After an ill-fated attempt by the British and French to defeat the Germans, French forces collapsed and allowed Germany to occupy the country. This resulted in a prolonged stalemate known as the Phony War. In December 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. This triggered a U.S. declaration of war and prompted a wave of Allied support for the conflict. In June 1944, the Allies launched the D-Day landings on the beaches of Normandy. Despite fierce fighting, the invasion went ahead and marked the beginning of the end for the Nazis. The final major event of World War II was the August 1945 atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. This final act of the war forced Japan to surrender and brought an end to 6 years of bloody conflict. These four major events marked the turning points of World War II and tell an incredible story of loss, struggle, and ultimate victory. Now, in the next chapter of the video, we'll take a deeper look at the root causes of the war. But before we start, I want to give special greetings to our viewers in Douglas Homes and out Westport. Y'all Negroes stay up. Now I would like to welcome everyone to World War II in a nutshell. We begin with its causes. The rise of fascism in the early part of the 20th century played a major role in the eventual outbreak of World War II, as the differing ideologies divided nations and created deep political and social unrest. Fascist ideologies have their roots in a mixture of extreme nationalism, strong authoritarianism, and a one-party government. These ideologies first reached prominence in Italy with the rise of Benito Mussolini, who served as the Prime Minister of Italy from 1922 to 1943. He was able to establish a totalitarian government by creating a powerful secret police force and strictly controlling the media. Mussolini's model of fascism inspired Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party in Germany. Hitler capitalized on the dissatisfaction of the German people who were feeling the effects of the Great Depression. He created a sense of hope among the people by promising the restoration of Germany's past greatness. Hitler and the Nazi Party emerged in the early 1930s and were able to gain power in just a few years. By 1939, Nazi Germany had grown in power, passing laws that excluded Jews from many aspects of life and invading neighboring countries such as Poland, sparking World War II. Following Germany's lead, other countries such as Italy, Romania, and Japan started to adopt fascist ideologies. Together with Nazi Germany, these countries formed the Axis powers, and together they constituted the main force of World War II. Fascism was a dangerous ideology because it sought to extend the power of a single nation or ethnic group at the expense of others. Its ideology was based on extreme nationalism, militarism, and totalitarianism. The policy of appeasement, spearheaded by European leaders prior to the outbreak of World War II, was a big contributor to the beginning of the deadly conflict. It is the historical narrative that countries like the United Kingdom, France and their allies were willing to make a series of concessions, particularly in terms of territorial gains to Germany in the late 1930s, with the hope of avoiding full-blown war. While it may have seemed like a logical approach on the surface, primarily as a way to buy time and avoid a costly military confrontation, it ultimately failed to appease Hitler and allowed him to continue marching across Europe. Amid this climate of appeasement, tensions began to rise as Germany became increasingly hostile in the late 1930s. Hitler and his Nazi party ignored many of the provisions of the Versailles Treaty and moved ahead with rebuilding the German military machine. This culminated with the annexation of Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1938 and 1939, respectively. Britain and France, despite strenuous objections and warnings issued by the international community, did little to intervene as Germany expanded its borders. Realizing that Europe was unwilling or unable to stand up against Germany's aggressive measures, Hitler moved ahead with his plans to take over Poland in 1939. This led to a major diplomatic crisis and the subsequent ultimatum issued by Britain and France, stating that they would declare war on Germany if the invasion took place. Hitler, unfazed by the warning, proceeded with the attack, leading both countries to declare war on Germany in September 1939 and officially beginning World War II. From there, the fate of Europe quickly shifted as major battles and campaigns began to spread across the continent. German forces pushed forward into Holland, Belgium, and France, wreaking havoc on local populations and putting significant pressure on Allied troops in the process. Ultimately, it was these clashes that truly marked the beginning of a major conflict that would soon engulf the globe and alter the course of history. The underlying cause of the battles discussed in the next chapter was ultimately the inability and unwillingness of the European powers to take decisive action against the increasingly dangerous threat of fascism. World War II was, by far, one of the deadliest wars of all time, and it saw some of the most momentous battles in history. From the Blitz in Europe to the fighting in the Pacific, some of these battles were major turning points in the war, cementing the victory of the Allies. In this video, you'll discover these 4 major battles of World War II and how they ultimately led to the victory of the Allied powers. The Battle for North Africa, 1940 to 1943. In 1940, Germany invaded North Africa, commencing the North African Campaign. This campaign pitted the Axis forces of German and Italian troops against Allied forces, particularly the United Kingdom, for control of North Africa. After several battles, the Allies claimed victory, which began a Western Allied push into Europe. The Battle of Stalingrad, 1942 to 1943. The Battle of Stalingrad was a major turning point in World War II. This battle pitted Germany against the Soviet Union in a strategic fight for control of the city of Stalingrad. After months of intense fighting, the Soviet Union's Red Army turned the tide against Germany in February 1943, ending with a decisive victory for the Soviet Union. The Battle of the Bulge, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge was offensive in the winter of 1944 to 1945 to push the Allied forces back into France. This was the last major German offensive of World War II and resulted in heavy losses for the Germans. The Allies ultimately emerged triumphant in this battle and went on to liberate much of Europe. The invasion of Normandy, 1944, Operation Overlord, commonly known as D-Day, was the Allied invasion of France and the start of the liberation of Nazi-occupied Europe. This was a pivotal moment in the history of World War II, as it began the Allied march eastward and marked the beginning of the end of the Nazi regime. The Battle for North Africa was one of the most important military campaigns of World War II, and one that had a far-reaching effect on the outcome of the conflict. Following the defeat of France in July 1940, the Allied powers Britain and France realized the need to prevent Nazi Germany from gaining control of the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean Sea. This led to the beginning of the North African Campaign on the 10th of June 1940. In what would become one of the most intense and decisive offensives of the war in Europe, the battle for North Africa was fought between the Axis powers and the Allied powers. The Axis forces, their objective was to capture the European and African territories of the British and French. The only choice for the Allies was to stop the Axis advances in North Africa, as well as fight to protect the Suez Canal from any Axis attempts to gain control of it. As such, the Allied forces had to make steady advances against the Axis in North Africa in order to prevent them from turning the Mediterranean Sea into a German stronghold. The battle for North Africa consisted of a series of battles and engagements, beginning with the German-Italian invasion of British-held Egypt in June 1940, and concluding with the Axis forces' final surrender in May 1943. During this time, the Allies and Axis forces were engaged in a series of intense skirmishes and battles, which ultimately resulted in a decisive victory for the Allies. In particular, the decisive Battle of El Alamein in October of 1942 was a crucial victory for the Allies, as it pushed the Axis forces back and led to their eventual defeat. The battle for North Africa played a decisive role in the outcome of World War II, as it ensured that the Allies were able to protect the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean Sea from the reach of the Axis forces. Furthermore, this victory allowed the Allies to launch their own campaign in North Africa and move into Europe, and ultimately help to bring an end to the war. As such, the battle for North Africa was crucial for the Allied cause, and it played an integral role in ultimately securing victory for the Allies in World War II. The Allies employed a variety of strategies in the battle for North Africa. The most important was their well-executed equipment and communications superiority, which they leveraged to gain the initiative early on in the campaign. In the latter part of the campaign, Allied forces employed a strategy known as leapfrogging, where each area of control was approached in rapid successive waves of armored infantry and air forces. Strategic bombing was a key element, while Allied forces focused on the disruption of supply lines and reinforcement and the psychological effects of air bombardment. The Axis forces sought to use their advantages in terrain, weather, and supply, as well as their numerical superiority to outmaneuver and outfight the Allies. However, their strategy was hampered by poor coordination, limited logistical and air support, and the constant threat of attacks from behind their own lines. They sought to exploit their defensive positions, retreat to gain better lines of attack, and employ counterpunching tactics. Threats from the rear were countered by setting up rear guard units and sneak attacks known as flanking. The battle for North Africa, which lasted from 1940 to 1943, was a decisive victory for the Allies over the Axis powers. This Allied victory set the stage for the Allies to begin their push across Europe and ultimately brought about the end of World War II. The North African campaign proved to be a turning point in the war. The decisive successes of the Allies in North Africa allowed them to relentlessly press on toward the final victory elsewhere in Europe. The Axis powers found themselves hoping to control vital resources and strategic points spread across the region. The Allies, on the other hand, after forming the necessary alliances, took the initiative early on. The African campaign saw the first use of combined operations, a strategy where land, sea, and air forces were all utilized to conduct a swift and efficient joint campaign. This innovative approach was the first of its kind, and rewrote the rules of engagement on the battlefield. By 1941, the Allies had gained control of the vital port town of Tobruk, resulting in German forces being pushed back eastward. A number of notable key battles followed that resulted in significant advances in the Allies' progress, such as El Alamein and the Battle of Kasserine Pass. The Battle of Tunisia in 1943 resulted in a total surrender of German forces in North Africa, and this victory effectively ended the campaign. The North African campaign saw the Allies gain a major asset in their continued push toward victory in Europe. The successful conclusion of this campaign provided a great boost of morale to their war efforts elsewhere in the world. Overall, the battle for North Africa demonstrated the Allies' determination and drive to succeed, even when faced with hardships and long odds. The success in North Africa allowed the Allies to set the stage for an invasion of Europe, driving the final nail in the Axis powers' coffin. This victory marked a significant turning point in World War II, showing how determined the Allies were in bringing about a secure peace after the global conflict. The battle for Stalingrad was one of the most important and decisive battles of World War II. Taking place in the summer of 1942 and ending in February of 1943, the battle saw the German army, led by Field Marshal Friedrich von Paulus, attempting to take the strategic city of Stalingrad on the Volga River in southern Russia. The city was an important industrial center and harbor on the Volga, making it a major symbol of Russian pride and make it a major objective for the invading German forces. On the other side of the Volga were the defenders of Stalingrad, which consisted of a variety of Soviet forces, led by General Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky. The defenders were helped by the terrain around the city, which was an extensive network of factories and other urban buildings. With these buildings and fortifications, the Russians were able to establish a formidable defensive line. The battle began in late August 1942 and was characterized by both sides fighting house to house, street to street, and hand-to-hand combat. The battle was a bloody affair with losses on both sides. German forces eventually pushed the Soviet defenders back to the banks of the Volga in early November, but the resistance continued. The turning point in the conflict came on November 19th, when Soviet forces mounted a counterattack on the Germans, cutting off their supplies and reinforcements, and ultimately leading to a complete encirclement of the Germans by Soviet forces. A few days later, General von Paulus asked for a surrender, and the Battle of Stalingrad ended in February 1943. The Battle of Stalingrad was the first major defeat for the German forces in World War II, and its casualties were estimated at more than 1 million on both sides. The victory in Stalingrad was a major turning point in the war, as it demonstrated for the first time the strength of the Red Army and the power of Russian persistence and determination. It was also the first major victory for the Allied forces and dealt a decisive blow to the morale of the German forces. This victory set the stage for the eventual defeat of Germany and the end of World War II. The Battle of Stalingrad took place from August 1942 to February 1943 and was one of the most intense battles of World War II in terms of casualties. During the battle, the Soviet forces defended their city against an onslaught from the invading German force led by General Friedrich Paulus. The Soviet strategy at Stalingrad. The Soviets developed a three-pronged strategy for defending Stalingrad. First, they relied on strength in numbers, using their superior troop size to take and hold defensive positions. They also created a strong inner defensive line that would help to break up and delay the advancing German forces. Finally, the Soviets employed a scorched earth strategy to deny the Germans access to much-needed supplies. The German strategy at Stalingrad. The Germans used air and ground assaults in an attempt to breach the Soviet lines. They relied heavily on blitzkrieg tactics, which involved rapidly advancing into and seizing enemy territory with the help of air power. In addition, the Germans used armored columns to attack and take key strategic positions, while also attempting to cut off and surround the city. Their goal was to reduce the city to rubble so that any Soviet forces would have nowhere to hide. The battle for Stalingrad was one of the most pivotal battles of World War II, as it marked the turning point on the Eastern Front. In what was a nearly year-long fight between the German and Soviet forces, the Soviet Union ultimately emerged victorious in February 1943. This outcome was critical for the Allied forces, as the decisive victory at Stalingrad demonstrated that Nazi Germany could be beaten and inspired hope and renewed morale in the Allied war effort. The battle for Stalingrad was one of the most costly battles of World War II, as an estimated 2 million soldiers and civilians lost their lives during the conflict. The battle serves as an important reminder of the costs of war and the need to work towards a more peaceful future. In a sense, the Battle of Stalingrad is symbolic of World War II itself, an epic struggle between two sides driven by nationalism, ideology, and the desire for power, with a devastating cost to human life. The Battle of the Bulge was one of the most significant battles of World War II. It took place between December 16, 1944, and January 25, 1945, in the Ardennes region of Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany, near the borders of France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. This battle was the last major German offensive campaign of the war, and the largest land battle ever fought by the United States Army. It was also the costliest in casualties, with a combined total of more than 100,000 casualties. The battle is considered to be one of the most important victories of World War II, as it forced the Nazis to retreat, eventually leading to their collapse. The Battle of the Bulge had a defining effect on the course of the war, pushing the Nazi forces further back into Germany and ensuring Allied victory. During this battle, Allied forces successfully managed to slow German advances and block the Axis control of Western Europe. The battle was a major turning point in the war and proved to be the last major offensive action taken by Nazi Germany. The Battle of the Bulge also represented the last chance for the Nazis to take back control of the war, but their efforts failed and resulted in their eventual surrender. The Battle of the Bulge was not only important for the eventual outcome of World War II, it also showed the great courage and determination of the Allied forces and their ability to fight and win despite the incredible odds. The battle also paved the way for later Allied successes in Europe. It provided the final victory and definitive end to the war in Europe, allowing for the liberation of Western Europe from the Nazis. Allied forces deployment of troops. The Allies deployed a series of troops for the Battle of the Bulge, including the United States 1st and 3rd and 9th Armies, the V Corps, and the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. They also had air support through the US 8 and 9 Tactical Air Commands. Use of artillery. The Allies used concentrated artillery barrages against German armored troops to slow their progress and cause significant casualties. This was supplemented by air attacks as well. Attack strategy. The Allies used a strategy of countering the Germans' main thrusts and attacking them on the flanks and in the rear in order to dislodge them from their positions. Defensive strategy. The Allies implemented a defensive strategy known as the Porcupine Defense. This strategy included troops setting up deep defensive lines in an effort to slow down and limit the Germans' advance. German forces deployment of troops. The German forces deployed troops from the 6th Panzer and 5th Panzer Grenadier Armies for the Battle of the Bulge, along with a significant amount of reserves. Use of artillery. The Germans relied heavily on their artillery barrages during the battle to slow down the Allied forces and defend their positions. Attack strategy. The Germans used a rolling attack strategy, where their panzers would move forward followed by infantry forces, in order to penetrate Allied lines at a quick pace. Defensive strategy. The Germans used a defensive strategy known as the elastic defense. This strategy aimed at giving the German forces a reserve of troops that could be quickly deployed to plug any gaps that arose due to counterattacks. The Battle of the Bulge was the last major German offensive campaign on the Western Front during World War II. It was launched through the densely forested Ardennes region of Wallonia in Belgium, France, and Luxembourg on December 16, 1944. The poorly supplied, outnumbered, and ill-prepared Germans were eventually forced to retreat in the face of strong Allied resistance, and the campaign ended officially on January 25, 1945, when the last of the German forces had been pushed out of the Bulge. The outcome of the Battle of the Bulge greatly weakened the German army, which helped lead to their eventual defeat in World War II. Nearly 90,000 soldiers were killed or captured, and the Allies advanced into Germany and forced them to surrender in April 1945. The victory of the Battle of the Bulge was an important event that solidified the Allies' confidence and will to fight the long war ahead. The Battle of the Bulge was a reminder of the immense cost of human life that can unfold during the war. It was a painful reminder of the global suffering caused by World War II and stands as a somber reminder of the fragility of human life. In its wake, it left an indelible mark on the hearts and minds of both those who fought and lived through it and those who followed in its wake. The invasion of Normandy was a critical event in World War II, not just for the Allied powers and Nazi Germans, but for the entire world. On June 6, 1944, the day now known as D-Day, the Allied forces began their assault on the beaches of Normandy in France, hoping to establish a break through the heavily defended coastline and open a second front against Hitler's Germany. The battle played a key role in the success of the Allied forces in eventually defeating the Nazis in Europe. The Normandy landings were the largest amphibious military operation in history, with 5 beaches divided among the Allied forces: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The plan was to land more than 150,000 Allied troops on the beaches, with the main objective of capturing the port city of Cherbourg. The landings were a tremendous success and helped turn the tide in the war against the Nazis. The Allies, with their superior forces, were able to break through German defenses and establish a foothold in the continent. They went on to march all the way to Berlin, eventually leading to Allied victory on May 8, 1945. The Normandy landings are widely seen as a turning point in the Second World War and a victory in the West, proving that Allied forces were dedicated and well prepared to fight the Nazis. More importantly, it marked the first successful major invasion into many countries across Europe that had been under the control of Hitler and Nazi Germany for over 5 years. While the invasion of Normandy had a lasting impact on the course of World War II, it also served to remind the world of the atrocities of war and the consequences of allowing a hostile government to rule freely. Allies Operation Neptune and Overlord. This was the overall Allied strategy for the invasion of Normandy. It involved a two-pronged approach. The first prong was Operation Neptune, which was the naval part of the operation and involved a massive fleet of ships, transporting troops and supplies to the Normandy beaches. The second prong was Operation Overlord, the land assault. It was the primary invasion force and was composed of British and American troops. Air power. The Allies made extensive use of air power during the invasion. The Allies launched an intense aerial bombardment campaign prior to the invasion to weaken German defenses. During the actual invasion, Allied fighter planes provided cover for the invading forces while they battled their way ashore. Deception tactics. The Allies attempted to deceive the Germans into thinking that the invasion would take place elsewhere. This included the use of false radio messages, dummy paratroopers, and a phantom army in southeast England. Naval bombardment. The Allies bombarded the German defenses along the coast using naval artillery from hundreds of ships. This was a crucial part of the invasion since it weakened the German positions prior to the landing. Movable artificial harbors. To support the invasion, the Allies built artificial harbor facilities known as mulberries, which enabled them to land troops and supplies directly onto the beaches from ships. Axis coastal defenses. The Axis forces had built an extensive network of coastal defenses along the Normandy beaches. These included a mix of obstacles, landmines, bunkers, and gun emplacements. Air power. The Axis Air Force attempted to repel the Allied invasion by launching air raids against the ships and troops landing on the beaches. Mobile forces. The Axis mobilized a number of mobile forces to try and counter the Allied landings. These included tanks, infantry, and artilleries, which were quickly deployed to the fight. Reinforcements. The Axis forces also sent troops and armored vehicles from other areas of France to help bolster the defenses on the beaches. Command and control. The Germans maintained tight control of the area, allowing them to respond quickly to Allied offensives and counterattacks. This control was largely due to the effective command and control systems the Axis forces had in place. The invasion of Normandy, which took place on June 6, 1944, was a critical Allied victory during World War II. Following months of meticulous planning and preparation, the Allies launched a combined air and sea invasion along a 50-mile stretch of the heavily fortified Normandy coastline. More than 150,000 Allied troops, including American, British, and Canadian forces, breached the heavily defended German beachhead. Within days, the Allies had secured the beaches, allowing them to advance inland and gain a foothold in France. The success of the invasion of Normandy marked a major turning point in World War II. With the Allies now firmly established on the European continent, they were able to launch further operations that eventually led to the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945. The invasion also proved to be a significant turning point in World War II and ultimately resulted in the Allies reclaiming Europe from Nazi Germany. In tribute, the Allies established the Normandy American Cemetery at Omaha Beach, which serves as a memorial to those who paid the ultimate sacrifice for freedom. World War II was one of the most impactful and devastating events in human history. The war, which started in 1939 and lasted until 1945, cost millions of lives worldwide, with an estimated 70 to 85 million people killed, the majority of whom were civilians. The conflict resulted in the displacement and deprivation of millions of people around the world, and is to this day one of the deadliest wars in human history. The war had a profound effect on the global balance of power. World War II saw the end of colonial empires such as the British, French, and Japanese empires. The Nazi regime, which had been on the rise in Germany since the 1920s, was ultimately ended in Europe, allowing the eventual establishment of democracies during the post-war era. The ramifications of the war remain today, more than 70 years after the conflict ended. The formation of the United Nations after the war serves as a lasting symbol of peace and cooperation between former enemies, and the tragic loss of life serves as a reminder of the horrors that warfare brings. Many of the populations displaced during the war were unable to return to their homes, and were left to start a new life in a foreign land. The impact of these population shifts can still be seen today in the changing demographics of many countries around the world. Overall, World War II was one of the most influential events in human history, and continues to affect our lives today more than 7 decades after the conflict ended. The loss of life, displacement of people, and shift in global power is only a few of the lasting impacts that can still be seen in the world today. Thank you for watching, and I hope this video was informative and of some value to you. Please consider Ole Smoke by liking, commenting, and subscribing. Your support means a lot for a new channel. You can also donate to the Cash App below, Insha'Allah, to keep information spreading and history alive. I know it's a cliche, but those that don't know history are doomed to repeat it. Shukran. And for your departure, here is a little-known fact. The Battle of the Atlantic was one of the longest-running naval battles in history, lasting over 5 years and costing over 200,000 lives.